So here's kind of a response that I can give having to do with what sorts of problems or issues do I usually deal with. Um, because what I've considered is largely theoretical, there are certain pre-existing frameworks that I've become familiarized with that have arguments within them, some of which are cyclical, i.e., China is adoptive of Marxist communism. That's a cyclical issue because that's constant. There are certain themes for Japan that are cyclical and thematic. The arguments that I've made in the past having to do with things that have staying power are manifold in terms of references that can be made by me or other people, having to do with things that have been successful or things that have been partially successful but now may be additionally successful in terms of where they may fit with the resolution of the Korean War. So the spread of emotion and intellect that I play to is pretty broad scaled in terms of the scope, because you're dealing with underlying powers of Africa, China, and India. But at the same time, we've reached a point now where there's a much more meager partisanship. So the bellicosity with which I or other people might approach things that have been thematic to me may vary. That's to say that if you go to a party, you're going to be a lot more amiable than if you go to a funeral. That's kind of the nature of human existence in terms of day-to-day operations. So, as someone who identifies with day-to-day life and the psychological imagery of our habitus, those are things that are intelligible to me, indeed, within China and developing or third world countries, as well as for America and Europe and Japan. So, things that crop up are interesting to me in terms of how they do or don't fit into pre-existing frameworks. So when contentions arise, that's the lens in which I see those problems, or lens through which I see those problems. In other words, there's a lot of issues that have been discussed, and roads that I've traveled continue to crop up. So responding to open threads, or threads that indeed the younger generation may open in terms of where they're headed, what works, what doesn't work. Those are all issues that people have all around the world. So it's difficult in one way to attack this broad array of issues, in that every geography has some variations to it, and the developing world has some nature to it that's different than the developed world. If you bend opposite directions, you kind of end up with neither side winning. So in my view, there's a sense to which the enlightened manager or profiteer is going to want to operate even in a capitalistic environment in such a way that the business is successful in terms of a moral and psychological victory. Making $2 billion versus making $4 billion versus making $1 trillion. There's some point at which you want to know what is that demarcated in. That's why people presumably own different stocks or own different companies, because they want what they own to be something that they believe in, and that within that underlying band of especially of psychic energy, there's a staying power to that, and you enjoy a habitus from what you choose to elect as your predilection. So in that way, the way I'm looking at these things has to do with self-enlightenment to an extent, that our predilection as capital owners or as functionaries some way in society has to do not just with purely competitive arguments where we end up in a monopoly that's run by no one, but in where even within a market you have reasonable differences between products and services, such that that's usually, I think, what people call a fair market. If you think about Netscape Navigator versus Internet Explorer, there's an array of issues that really run the gamut of the world and ideology in terms of how Netscape Navigator versus Internet Explorer have a multiplex issues in terms of creating a monopoly or maintaining a status quo situation. And that's interesting. It's probably still going on now in terms of those companies still exist. From my point of view, those would be interesting to see play out. Insofar as relevant issues are at play, those potentially could affect what happens in the business world or in the political world. You kind of have a sense at which, if things aren't mitigated in a business sense, they then turn into a political or apolitical issue. You run the risk of corruption, anti-corruption government generating, and those would be reasons why you'd want to steer the ship you're on, so you don't end up creating a problem that didn't exist before you started getting your hands all over something.